sackcloth, the clothing of the penitent, confessed traitors. The first of the prisoners was licking his lips, eyes darting here and there, pale with terror. The second, shorter and thicker set, was stumbling, dragging his left leg behind him, hunched over with his mouth hanging open. As Giselle watched, a thin line of pink drool dangled from his lip and spattered on the tiles.
Are you hunting something?
The third man, painfully thin, and with huge dark rings round his eyes, stared slowly around, blinking, eyes wide, but apparently taking nothing in. Giselle recognized the man behind the three prisoners straight away, the big albino from that night in the street. Giselle rocked his weight from one foot to the other, feeling suddenly cold and uncomfortable. The purpose of the bench was now made clear. The three prisoners slumped down on it. The albino knelt and snapped their manacles shut around the rail along its base. The chamber was entirely silent. Every eye was fixed on the crippled inquisitor and his three prisoners.
Our investigation began some months ago,
said Archlector Salt, immensely smug at having the assembly so completely under his control.
A simple matter of some irregular accounting. I won't bore you with the details.
He smiled at Brock and his
I know you all are very busy men. Who could have thought then that such a little matter would lead us here? Who would suppose that the roots of treason could run so very deep?
Indeed, said the Lord Chamberlain impatiently, looking up from his goblet. Inquisitor Glockter, the floor is yours. The announcer struck his staff on the tile.
The Open Council of the Union recognizes Sandan Glockter, Inquisitor exempt.
The cripple waited politely for the scratching of the clerk's quills to finish, leaning on his cane in the center of the floor, seemingly unmoved by the importance of the occasion. Rise and face the Open Council, he said, turning to the first of his prisoners. The terrified man sprang up, his chains rattling, licking his pale lips, goggling at the faces of the lords in the front row. Your name?
Why are you
demanded
here?
Glockter.
Salem Ruse!
Giselle felt a catch in his throat. Salem Ruse. He knew the man. His father had had dealings with him in the past. At one time, he had been a regular visitor to their estate. Giselle studied the terrified, shaven-headed traitor with increasing horror. He cast his mind back to the plump, well-dressed merchant, always ready with a joke. It was him, no doubt. Their eyes met for an instant, and Giselle looked anxiously away. His father had talked with that man in their hallway, had shaken hands with him. Accusations of treason are like illnesses. You can catch them just by being in the same room. His eyes were drawn inevitably back to that unfamiliar, yet horribly familiar face. Yeah, traitor bastard. You are a member of the Honorable Guild of Merthers, continued Glockter, with a sneering accent into the word honorable. I was, mumbled Ruse. What was your role within the guild? The shaven-headed mercer stared desperately about him. Your role? Demanded Glockter, his voice taking on a hard edge. I conspired to defraud the king, cried the merchant, wringing his hands. A wave of shock ran down the hall. Giselle swallowed sour spit. He saw Salt smirking across at High Justice Morovia. The old man's face was stony blank, but his fists were clenched tight on the table before him. I committed treason for money. I smuggled, and I bribed, and I lied. We were all at it. All at it. Glockter leered round at the assembly. And if any of you should doubt it, we have ledgers, and we have documents, we have numbers. There is a room in the House of Questions stuffed with them. A room full of secrets, guilt, and blood. He slowly shook his head. Sorry reading, I can tell you. I had to do it, screamed Ruse.
They made me! I had no choice!
The crippled Inquisitor frowned at his audience. Of course. We realize you were but a single brick in this house of infamy. An attempt was made on your life recently, was it not?
They tried to kill me!
Who tried?
It was this man!
Wailed Ruse, voice cracking, pointing a trembling finger at the prisoner next to him, pulling away as far as the chains that linked them would allow.
It was him! Him!
The manacles rattled as he waved his arm, spit flying from his mouth. There was another surge of angry voices, louder this time. Giselle watched the head of the middle prisoner sag, and he slumped sideways. The hulking albino grabbed him and pulled him back up. "Wake up, Master Carpi!" shouted Glockner. Lolling head came slowly up. An unfamiliar face, strangely swollen and badly pocked with acne scars. Giselle noticed with disgust that his 4 front teeth were missing, just like Glockner. "You are from Talion, yes? In Styria?" The man nodded slowly, stupidly, like someone half asleep. "You are paid to kill him, yes?" He nodded again. "And you were hired to murder 10 of His Majesty's subjects, among them this confessed traitor, Salem Ruse?" A trickle of blood ran slowly out from the man's nose, and his eyes started to roll back in his head. The albino shook him by the shoulder, and he came round, nodding groggily. "What became of the other 9? Silence. "You killed them, did you not?" Another nod, a strange clicking sound coming from the prisoner's throat. Glockner frowned slowly around the rapt faces of the council. "Willem Dan Robb, customs official. Throat cut ear to ear." He slid a finger across his neck, and the woman in the gallery squealed. "Solimo Scandi, Mercer, stabbed in the back 4 times. He thrust up 4 fingers, then pressed them to his stomach, as though sick. "The bloody list goes on. All murdered, for nothing but a bigger profit. Who hired you?" Croaked the killer, turning his swollen face to look at the gaunt man with the glassy eyes, slumped on the bench next to him, heedless of his surroundings. Glockner limped over, cane tapping on the tiles. "What is your name?" The prisoner's head snapped up, his eyes focusing on the twisted face of the Inquisitor above him.
Gottfried Hornlack!
He answered instantly, voice shrill. "You are a senior member of the Guild of Mercers?"
Yes!
He barked, blinking mindlessly up at Glockner. "One of Magister Cult's deputies, in fact?"
Yes!
"Have you conspired with other Mercers to defraud His Majesty the King? Did you hire an assassin to murder 10 of His Majesty's subjects?"
Yes! Yes!
Why?
We were worried they would tell what they knew. Tell what they knew. Tell...
Hornlack's empty eyes stared off towards one of the colored windows. His mouth slowly stopped moving. "Tell what they knew?" prompted the Inquisitor.
About the treasonous activities of the Guild.
The Mercer blurted.
About our treasons. About the activities of the Guild. Treasonous activities.
Glockner cut in sharply. "Were you acting alone?"
No, no.
The Inquisitor rapped his cane down before him and leaned forward. "Who gave the orders?" he hissed.
Magister Colt,
shouted Hornlack instantly.
He gave the orders.
The audience gasped. Archlector Salt smirked a little wider.
It was the Magister.
The quills scratched mercilessly.
It was Colt. He gave the orders. All the orders. Magister Colt.
Thank you, Master Hornlack.
The Magister. He gave the orders. Magister Colt. Colt. Colt.
Enough! Snarled Glockner. His prisoner fell silent. The room was still. Arch-Lector Sult lifted his arm and pointed toward the three prisoners.
There is your proof, my lords.
This is a sham!
Bellowed Lord Brock, leaping to his feet.
This is an insult!
Few voices joined him in support, however, and those that did were half-hearted. Lord Huygen was notable for his careful silence, keenly studying the fine leather of his shoes. Arazin had shrunk back into his seat, looking half the size he had been a minute before. Lord Isher was staring off at the wall, fingering his heavy golden chain, looking bored, as though the fate of the Guild of Mercers was of interest to him no longer. Brock appealed to the High Justice himself, motionless in his tall chair at the high table.
Lord Moravia, I beg of you, you are a reasonable man. Do not allow this travesty.
The hall fell silent, waiting for the old man's reply. He frowned and stroked his long beard. He glanced across at the grinning Arch-Lector. He cleared his throat.
I feel your pain, Lord Brock. Indeed I do. But it seems that this is not a day for reasonable men. The closed council has examined the case and is well satisfied. My hands are tied.
Brock worked his mouth, hasting to feet.
Who goes there?
This is not justice!
He shouted, turning round to address his peers.
These men have plainly been tortured.
Arch-Lector Salt's mouth twisted with scorn.
How would you have us deal with traitors and criminals?
He cried in a piercing voice.
Would you raise a shield, Lord Brock, for the disloyal to hide behind?
He thumped the table, as if it too might be guilty of high treason.
I, for one, will not see our great nation handed over to its enemies. Neither enemies without, nor enemies within. Down with the Mercers!
Came a cry from the public balcony.
Hard justice for traitors! The King's justice!
Bellowed a fat man near the back. There was a surge of anger and agreement from the floor, and calls for harsh measures and stiff penalties. Brock looked round for his allies on the front row, but found none. Bunched his fists.
This is no justice!
He shouted, pointing at the three prisoners.
This is no proof! His Majesty disagrees,
Bellowed Hop.
and does not require your permission.
He held up a large document.
The Guild of Mercers is hereby dissolved, their license revoked by royal decree. His Majesty's Commission for Trade and Commerce will, over the coming months, review applications for trade rights with the city of Westport. Until such time as suitable candidates are found, the routes will be managed by capable, loyal hands. The hands of His Majesty's Inquisition.
Arch-Lector Salt humbly inclined his head, oblivious to the furious cries from representatives of the public gallery alike.
Inquisitor Glockta,
Continued the Lord Chamberlain.
the Open Council thanks you for your diligence and asks that you perform one more service in this matter.
Hoff held out a smaller paper.
This is a warrant for the arrest of Magister Colt, bearing the King's own signature. We would ask that you serve it forthwith.
Glockta bowed stiffly and took the paper from the Lord Chamberlain's outstretched hand.
You,
Said Hoff, turning his eye on Jallenhorn.
Lieutenant Jallenhorn, my lord!
Shouted the big man, stepping smartly forward.
whatever,
Snapped Hoff impatiently.
take 20 of the King's own and escort Inquisitor Glockta to the Mercers Guildhall. Ensure that nothing and no one leaves the building without his orders.
At once, my lord.
Jallenhorn crossed the floor and ran up the aisle toward the exit, holding the hilt of his sword in one hand to stop it knocking against his leg. Glockta limped after him, cane tapping on the steps, the warrant for the arrest of Magister Colt crumpled in his tightly clenched fist. The monstrous albino had pulled the prisoners to their feet meanwhile, and was leading them, rattling and lolling, off towards the door by which they had entered.
Lord Chamberlain,
Shouted Brock with one last effort. Giselle wondered how much money he must have made from the Mercers, how much he had hoped still to make. A very great deal, evidently. But Hoff was unmoved.
That concludes our business for today, my lords.
Barovia was on his feet before the Lord Chamberlain had finished speaking, evidently keen to be away. The great ledgers were thumped shut. The fate of the Honourable Guild of Mercers was sealed. Excited babbling filled the air once more, gradually rising in volume and soon joined by clattering and stamping as the representatives began to rise and leave the room. Archlector Salt remained seated, watching his beaten adversaries file reluctantly off the front row. Giselle met the desperate eyes of Salem Ruse one last time as he was led towards the small door. Then Practical Frost jerked at the chain, and he was lost in the darkness beyond. Outside, the square was even busier than before, the dense throng growing ever more excited as the news of the dissolution of the Guild of Mercers spread to those who had not been within. People stood disbelieving or hurried here and there, scared, surprised, confused. Giselle saw one man staring at him, staring at anyone, face pale, hands trembling. A Mercer, perhaps, or a man in too deep with the Mercers, deep enough to be ruined along with them. There would be many such men. Giselle felt a sudden tingling. R.D. West was leaning casually against the stones a little further on. They had not met in some time, not since that drunken outburst of hers, and he was surprised how pleased he was to see her. Probably she had been punished long enough, he told himself. Everyone deserved the chance to apologize. He hastened towards her with a broad smile on his lips. Then he noticed who she was with. That little bastard, he muttered under his breath. Lieutenant Brint was chatting freely in his cheap uniform, leaning closer to R.D. than Giselle thought was appropriate, underlining his tedious points with flamboyant gestures of his arms. She was nodding, smiling. Then she tipped her head back and laughed, slapping the lieutenant playfully on the chest. Brint laughed as well. The ugly little shit. They laughed together. For some reason, Giselle felt a sharp pang of fury.
Are you hunting something?
Giselle! How are you? Shouted Brint, still giggling. He stepped up close. That's Captain Luther, he spat. And how I am is none of your concern. Don't you have a job to do? Brint's mouth hung stupidly open for a moment, then his brows drew into a surly frown. Yes, sir, he muttered,
Are you hunting
turning
something?
and stalking off. Giselle watched him go with a contempt even more intense than usual. Well, that was charming, said R.D. Those the manners you should use before a lady? I really couldn't say. Why? Was there one watching?
Never.
He turned to look at her and caught, just for a moment, a self-satisfied smirk. Quite a nasty expression, as though she had enjoyed his outburst. He wondered for a silly instant whether she might have arranged the meeting, have placed herself and that idiot where Giselle would see them, hoping to arouse his jealousy. Then she smiled at him and laughed, and Giselle felt his anger fading. She looked very fine, he thought, tanned and
Who
vibrant
goes
in the
there?
sunlight, laughing out loud, not caring who heard. Very fine. Better than ever, in fact. A chance meeting was all. What else could it be? She fixed him with those dark eyes, and his suspicions vanished. Did you have to be so hard on him? She asked. Giselle fixed his jaw. Jumped up, arrogant nobody. He's probably nothing more than some rich man's bastard. No blood, no money, no manners. More than me, of all three. Giselle cursed his big mouth. Rather than dragging an apology from her, he was now in need of giving one himself. He sought desperately for some way out of this self-made trap. Oh, but he's an absolute moron, he whined. Well, and Giselle was relieved to see one corner of R.D.'s mouth curl up in a sly smile, he is at that. Shall we walk? She slipped her hand through his arm before he had the chance to answer and started to lead him off towards the Kingsway. Giselle allowed himself to be guided between the frightened, the angry, the excited people. "So is it true?" she asked. "Is what true?" "That the Mercers are finished." "So it seems. Your old friend Sandan Glockter was in the thick of it. He gave quite the performance for a cripple." Ardy looked down at the floor. "You wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of him, crippled or no?" "No." Giselle's mind went back to Salem Rue's terrified eyes, staring desperately at him as he vanished into the darkness of the archway. No, he wouldn't. A silence descended on them as they strolled down the avenue, but it was a comfortable one. He liked walking with her. It no longer seemed important whether anyone apologized. Perhaps she had been right about the fencing anyway, just a little. Ardy seemed to read his thoughts. "How's the sword play going?" she asked. "Not bad. How's the drinking going?" She raised a dark eyebrow. "Excellent well. If only there was a contest for that every year, I'd soon come to the attention of the public." Giselle laughed, looking down at her as she walked beside him, and she
Why are
smiled
you
back.
here?
So clever, so sharp, so fearless, so damn fine-looking. Giselle wondered if there had ever been a woman quite like her. If only she had the right blood, he thought to himself, and some money. A lot of money. Chapter 21. Means of Escape. "Open the door in the name of His Majesty!" thundered Lieutenant Jallenholm for the third time, hammering at the wood with his meaty fist. The great oaf. Why do big men tend to have such little brains? Perhaps they get by on brawn too often, and their minds dry up like plums in the sun. The Mercers' Guildhall was an impressive building in a busy square not far from the Agriant. A substantial crowd of onlookers had already gathered around Glockter and his armed escort, curious, fearful, fascinated, growing all the time. They can smell blood, it seems. Glockter's leg was throbbing from the effort of hurrying down here, but he doubted that the Mercers would be taken entirely by
Never
surprise.
anger a no.
He glanced round impatiently at the armored guardsmen, at the masked practicals, at the hard eyes of Frost, at the young officer beating on the door. "Open the—" Enough of this foolishness. "I think they heard you, Lieutenant," said Glockter crisply, "but are choosing not to answer. Would you be so kind as to break the door down?" "What?" Jallenholm gawped at him, and then at the heavy double doors firmly secured. "How will I—" Practical Frost hurtled past. There was a deafening crack and a tearing of wood as he crashed into one of the doors with his burly shoulder, tearing it off its hinges and sending it crashing onto the floor of the room beyond. "Like so," muttered Glockter as he stepped through the archway, the splinters still settling. Jallenholm followed him, looking dazed, a dozen armored soldiers clattering behind. An outraged clerk blocked the corridor beyond. "You can't just goof!" he cried as Frost flung him out of the way and his face crunched into the wall. "Arrest that man!" shouted Glockter, waving his cane at the dumbstruck clerk. One of the soldiers grabbed him roughly with gauntleted fists and shoved him tumbling out into the daylight. Practicals began to pour through the broken doors, heavy sticks in their hands, eyes fierce above their masks. "Arrest everyone!" shouted Glockter over his shoulder, limping down the corridor as fast as he could, following Frost's broad back into the bowels of the building. Through an open door, Glockter saw a merchant in colourful robes, face covered with a sheen of sweat as he desperately heaped documents onto a blazing fire. "Seize him!" screamed Glockter. A pair of practicals leapt past into the room and began clubbing the man with their sticks. He fell with a cry, upsetting a table and kicking over a pile of ledgers. Loose papers and bits of burning ash fluttered through the air as the sticks rose and fell. Glockter hurried on, crashes and cries spreading out into the building around him. The place was full of the smell of smoke and sweat and fear. The doors are all guarded, but Colt might have a secret means of escape. He's a slippery one. We must hope we are not too late. Curse this leg of mine. Not too late. Glockter gasped and winced in pain, tottering as someone clutched at his coat. "Help me!" shrieked the man. "I am innocent!" Blood on a plump face. Fingers clutched at Glockter's clothes, threatening to drag him to the floor. "Get him off me!" shouted Glockter, beating at him weakly with his cane, clawing at the wall in his efforts to stay upright. One of the practicals leapt forward and clubbed the man across the back.
How can I...
"I confess!" the merchant whimpered as the stick rose again, then it cracked down on his head. The practical caught hold of his slumping body under the arms and dragged him back towards the door. Glockter hurried on, Lieutenant Jallenhorm wide-eyed at his shoulder. They reached a broad staircase, and Glockter eyed it with hatred. My old enemies, always here ahead of me. He labored up as best he could, waving Practical Frost forward with his free hand. A baffled merchant was dragged past them and away, squawking something about his rights, heels kicking against the stairs. Glockter slipped and nearly fell on his face, but someone caught him by the elbow and kept him upright. It was Jallenhorm, a look of confusion still splattered across his heavy, honest face. So, big men have their uses after all. The young officer helped him up the rest of the steps. Glockter did not have the energy to refuse him. Why bother? A man should know his limitations. There's nothing noble in falling on your face. I should know that. There was a large antechamber at the top of the stairs, richly decorated with a thick carpet and colourful hangings on the walls. 2 guards stood before a large door with their swords drawn, dressed in the livery of the Guild of Mercers. Frost was facing them, hands rolled into white fists. Jallenhorm pulled out his own sword as he reached the landing, stepping forward to stand next to the albino. Glockter had to smile. The tongueless torturer and the flower of chivalry. An unlikely alliance. "I have a warrant for Colt, signed by the king himself." Glockter held out the paper so the guards could see it. "The Mercers are finished. You have nothing to gain by getting in our way. Put up your swords. You have my word you will not be harmed." The 2 guards glanced at each other uncertainly. "Put them up!" shouted Jallenhorm, edging a little closer. "All right." One of the men bent down and slid his sword along the boards. Frost caught it under one foot. "And you!" shouted Glockter to the other one. "Now!" The guard obeyed, throwing his sword to the floor and putting up his hands. A moment later, Frost's fist crunched into the point of his jaw, knocking him cold and sending him crashing into the wall. "But," shouted the first guard. Frost grabbed him by the shirt and flung him down the stairs. He turned over and over, banging on the steps, flopping to the bottom, lying still. I know what that feels like. Jallenhorm was standing motionless and blinking, his sword still raised. "I thought you said—" "Never mind about that. Frost, look for another way in." The albino padded away down the corridor. Glockter gave him a moment, then he edged forward and tried the door. The handle turned, much to his surprise, and the door swung open.